Ambassador Jake Harrison had negotiated trade agreements with some of the galaxy's most difficult species, but nothing in his diplomatic training had prepared him for Queen Seraphina of the Etherian Empire. She sat on her crystalline throne with the casual grace of someone who had ruled for over 1,000 years, her luminescent silver hair cascading over shoulders that seemed carved from starlight itself. Her pointed ears, elegantly swept back, and the faint glow that emanated from her translucent skin marked her as unmistakably Etherian, a species that had achieved immortality while humanity was still discovering fire. "Ambassador Harrison," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made every word sound like music, "your proposal is interesting. However, I fail to see why the Etherian Empire should grant mining rights to a species whose commitment to long-term agreements is, by necessity, limited by your brief lifespans." Jake fought to maintain diplomatic composure as frustration built in his chest. This was the third day of negotiations, and every attempt to establish meaningful trade relationships had been met with the same polite dismissal. The Etherians viewed humanity as a curious but ultimately temporary phenomenon, interesting enough to study, but too short-lived to warrant serious partnership. "Your Majesty," Jake replied carefully, "while individual humans have limited lifespans, our civilization's commitment to agreements spans generations. We have maintained treaties for centuries, passing obligations from parents to children as sacred trusts." Queen Seraphina's smile was beautiful and devastating in its condescension. "Centuries, Ambassador. I have ruled this empire for 10 times that duration. Your entire recorded history is but a moment in Etherian experience. How can we trust that your successors will honor agreements made by beings they will never meet?" Around the throne room, Etherian courtiers, and Jake's own diplomatic staff watched the exchange with the polite attention of beings observing a ritual whose outcome was already determined. The elite guard that flanked the Queen's throne stood at perfect attention, their ceremonial armor gleaming with embedded crystals that pulsed in rhythm with their heartbeats. "Your Majesty," Jake said, trying a different approach, "our brief lifespans are precisely why our commitments carry such weight. When humans make promises, we do so knowing that we're binding not just ourselves, but our children and their children. We take the responsibility of legacy seriously because we know our time is limited." "An interesting philosophical position," the Queen mused, her ageless eyes studying Jake with what might have been genuine curiosity. "Yet philosophy does not guarantee performance. What happens when your descendants decide that agreements made by the long-dead no longer serve their interests?" Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with diplomatic dead ends. He'd spent months preparing for these negotiations, studying Etherian culture and psychology, but every angle seemed to lead to the same fundamental problem: how do you prove commitment to beings who measure time in millennia when your entire species thinks in decades? "Your Majesty," he said, abandoning formal diplomatic language in favor of direct honesty, "what would it take to convince you that humanity is capable of lasting partnership? What proof could we offer that our word carries weight beyond the span of individual lives?" Queen Seraphina leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from polite interest to something approaching engagement. "That, Ambassador, is perhaps the first truly interesting question you've asked. The answer is that I'm not certain such proof exists. Your species operates on timescales that make meaningful partnership challenging." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Jake could feel his diplomatic mission slipping away, could see the months of preparation and the hopes of his government dissolving into another polite rejection from an immortal empire that viewed humanity as a brief flicker in the darkness of space. It was desperation, pure and simple, that made him say what came next. Desperation mixed with 3 days of frustration, with the certainty that conventional diplomacy was doomed to fail, and with the growing realization that Queen Seraphina herself might be as trapped by her immortal perspective as humanity was by its mortal limitations. "What if I married you?" The words tumbled out before Jake's diplomatic training could stop them, echoing through the crystal-domed throne room with the clarity of a bell struck in silence. The effect was immediate and electric. Courtiers gasped, guards tensed, and Jake's own staff looked ready to drag him away before he could cause an interstellar incident. But it was Queen Seraphina's reaction that truly mattered. For the first time since Jake had met her, the immortal ruler looked genuinely surprised. Her luminescent eyes widened, her perfect composure cracked just enough to reveal something startlingly human beneath the divine facade, and for a moment she simply stared at him as if he'd spoken in a language she'd never heard before. "I mean," Jake continued, his diplomatic instincts finally catching up with his mouth and attempting damage control, "would that prove humanity's commitment to lasting partnerships? If one of us was willing to bind our life to yours, to make our species' word literally our bond?" The throne room had gone dead silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of a dozen stares from beings who had just witnessed either the most brilliant diplomatic gambit in galactic history or the most spectacular career-ending mistake ever recorded. Queen Seraphina stood slowly, her movements as graceful as flowing water, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. When she spoke, her voice carried a new quality, not the musical diplomacy of before, but something more immediate, more real. "Guards," she said quietly, "withdraw." The elite soldiers hesitated for the briefest moment, clearly uncertain whether they should leave their immortal queen alone with a human who had just made what could be interpreted as either a proposal or a threat. But Queen Seraphina's authority was absolute, and after 1,000 years of rule, her commands were not questioned. "All of you," she continued, her gaze now encompassing the courtiers and diplomatic staff. "Leave us." The exodus was swift and silent, beings of multiple species filing out of the throne room with the kind of disciplined efficiency that spoke of long experience with royal commands. Jake's own diplomatic team cast worried glances his way, clearly uncertain whether they should abandon their ambassador to face whatever came next alone. "Ambassador Harrison will be perfectly safe," Queen Seraphina assured them, though something in her tone suggested that his safety might be the least interesting aspect of what was about to unfold. Within minutes, the vast throne room was empty except for Jake and the immortal ruler whose empire spanned star systems. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities that neither of them had imagined when the day began. "Ambassador," Queen Seraphina said finally, descending from her throne with steps that seemed to barely touch the crystal floor, "in 1,000 years of rule, I have received many proposals. Political alliances, trade agreements, territorial negotiations, and yes, even marriage contracts designed to secure diplomatic advantage." She moved closer, close enough that Jake could see the subtle patterns of light that played beneath her translucent skin, could catch the faint scent of ozone and starlight that seemed to surround her. "But never," she continued, her voice now carrying an intimacy that made the vast throne room feel suddenly small, "has anyone suggested marriage as a solution to a commercial disagreement with such obvious sincerity mixed with complete desperation." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Your Majesty, I—" "Please," she interrupted, raising a hand that seemed to glow with its own inner light, "call me Seraphina. After all, you've just proposed to me. I think we can dispense with some of the formal protocols. Despite everything, the diplomatic disaster he'd just created, the career-ending implications of his impulsive words, the sheer impossibility of what he'd suggested, Jake found himself smiling. "Seraphina," he said, testing how her name felt on his tongue, "I should probably mention that I didn't exactly plan to propose marriage during a trade negotiation." "No," she replied, and for the first time since he'd met her, her smile seemed completely genuine, "I don't imagine you did." Which is precisely what makes it so interesting. As they stood alone in the crystalline vastness of her throne room, Jake realized that his desperate gambit had accomplished something that 3 days of careful diplomacy had failed to achieve. He had surprised an immortal queen into seeing him as something other than a representative of a brief and insignificant species. Whether that would save his diplomatic mission or destroy what remained of his career was still an open question. But for the first time since arriving on Ethereal Prime, Jake felt like he was having a real conversation rather than reciting lines from a script written by beings who viewed his entire species as a footnote in galactic history. The silence that followed Jake's impromptu proposal stretched between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Queen Seraphina moved to the great windows that dominated one wall of the throne room, her luminescent form framed against the vista of her capital city stretching toward multiple horizons. From this height, the Etherian civilization looked like a symphony of light and crystal, with floating spires that defied gravity and transport streams that flowed like rivers of pure energy. "Do you know what it's like, Jake," she said, using his first name for the first time, "to watch civilizations rise and fall like seasons? To see species achieve greatness, flourish for what seems like an eye blink, then fade into historical footnotes." Jake joined her at the window, careful to maintain respectful distance while acknowledging the intimacy her question implied. "I can't imagine it. The longest human perspective spans maybe a century of personal experience. We measure legacy in generations, not millennia. I have ruled for longer than your entire recorded history," Serafina continued, her voice carrying a weariness that her ageless features couldn't quite conceal. "I have signed treaties with species that no longer exist, made alliances with empires that crumbled to dust while I watched. When you've experienced that pattern enough times, it becomes difficult to see new partnerships as anything more than temporary diversions." Jake studied her profile, noting the way starlight from the windows seemed to gather in her silver hair. "Is that why you dismissed your guards? Because my proposal was a diversion?" Serafina turned to face him, her luminescent eyes showing depths that spoke of centuries of accumulated experience. "I dismissed them because, for the first time in longer than I care to calculate, someone surprised me. In 1,000 years of rule, I have become accustomed to predicting how conversations will unfold, how beings will react, what they will ask for and how they will try to obtain it." She moved closer, close enough that Jake could see the subtle patterns of bioluminescence that flowed beneath her translucent skin like captured aurora. Marriage proposals, in particular, follow very predictable patterns. Political alliances disguised as romance, strategic unions designed to consolidate power, diplomatic arrangements wrapped in ceremonial sentiment. I have received hundreds of such proposals, and I could recite the arguments they contain from memory. But mine was different. "Yours was honest," she said simply. "Desperately, impulsively, completely honest. You didn't propose marriage because you had calculated its strategic value. You proposed it because you were frustrated with diplomatic failure and grasping for any solution that might bridge the gap between our people's different perspectives on time and commitment." Jake felt his diplomatic instincts warring with personal curiosity. The conversation had moved far beyond anything covered in his training, but Serafina's willingness to speak candidly seemed too valuable to waste on protocol. "Was I wrong to suggest it?" he asked. "The marriage, I mean, not just the diplomatic approach." Serafina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze returning to the cityscape beyond the windows. "That's a more complex question than you might realize. Etherian marriage customs differ significantly from human practices. We don't marry for companionship or emotional fulfillment in the way shorter-lived species do. When you live forever, relationships must be built on different foundations." "What foundations?" "Intellectual compatibility. Shared purpose. The ability to grow and change together across centuries without becoming stagnant." She paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "And perhaps most importantly, the wisdom to give each other space to evolve without losing the connection that brought you together in the first place." Jake found himself genuinely curious about the implications of immortal relationships. "Have you ever been married? I mean, by Etherian standards." "Twice," Serafina admitted. "Both unions lasted approximately 3 centuries before we grew in directions that made continued partnership incompatible. The partings were amicable, though they both chose to enter extended stasis rather than watch me continue growing while they remained fixed in the patterns that had once brought us together." The loneliness in her voice was unmistakable, though Jake suspected she would deny it if he commented directly. "And since then?" "Since then, I have focused on ruling. On building something that could outlast even my extended lifespan. On creating structures and institutions that could maintain stability across the kind of temporal scales that younger species can barely comprehend." Before Jake could respond, the throne room's main doors opened to admit a figure whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere from intimate conversation to potential confrontation. Lord Commander Voss strode into the chamber with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested urgent business, his crystalline armor marking him as one of Seraphina's most trusted advisors. "Your Majesty," he said, offering a precise bow before his gaze fixed on Jake with obvious suspicion, "I apologize for the interruption, but urgent matters require your attention." Seraphina's expression shifted smoothly from personal openness to royal authority. "What matters, Voss?" "Reports from our intelligence networks indicate unusual human military movements in sectors adjacent to our territory. Ship deployments that could be interpreted as preparation for expanded operations." His eyes never left Jake as he spoke. "Some members of the Council are questioning whether this diplomatic mission might be providing cover for more aggressive human intentions." Jake felt the careful progress of the past hour threatening to collapse into accusations and mistrust. "Lord Commander, I can assure you that humanity has no aggressive intentions toward the Etherian Empire. Our ship movements are routine patrol adjustments in response to increased pirate activity in the outer systems." "How convenient," Voss replied coldly, "that such routine adjustments coincide with negotiations for access to crystals that could accelerate human technological development by centuries." The implication was clear. That Jake's diplomatic mission was cover for some larger human strategy to challenge Etherian dominance. It was a logical concern from the perspective of a species that had maintained galactic supremacy for millennia, but it also demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that made meaningful partnerships so difficult to achieve. "Voss," Seraphina said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded respect across multiple centuries, "your concerns are noted and will be investigated through proper channels. In the meantime, Ambassador Harrison remains our honored guest, and his safety is guaranteed by my personal word." The Lord Commander's expression showed he wanted to argue, but 1,000 years of service had taught him when to accept royal decisions, even when he disagreed with them. "Of course, Your Majesty. Though I would recommend additional security protocols during the remainder of the diplomatic mission." After Voss departed, the intimacy of their earlier conversation felt more fragile, shadowed by the political realities that surrounded both their positions. Jake realized that his impulsive proposal had created complications he hadn't anticipated, not just for himself, but for Seraphina, whose every action was scrutinized by advisors who measured policy decisions against centuries of accumulated wisdom. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to create problems for you with your council." Seraphina's smile held traces of the genuine warmth she'd shown earlier, though it was now tempered with royal caution. "Jake, you proposed marriage to an immortal queen during a trade negotiation. If creating problems wasn't part of your intention, you might want to reconsider your approach to diplomacy." Despite the tension Voss's interruption had created, Jake found himself laughing. "Point taken. Though I should probably mention that my government's diplomatic training manual doesn't have a chapter on marriage proposals to immortal rulers." "Perhaps it should," Seraphina replied, moving back toward her throne with steps that seemed to barely disturb the crystal floor. "Though I suspect the chapter would be quite brief. Something along the lines of, don't." As she settled back onto her throne, the transformation from intimate conversation partner to imperial ruler was subtle but complete. Jake realized he was witnessing something few beings had ever seen, the practiced ease with which an immortal adjusted to the different roles required by her position. "Your Majesty," he said, falling back into formal address as their situation required, "where do we go from here? Both with the trade negotiations and with the other matter we discussed." Seraphina's expression grew thoughtful, her luminescent eyes studying Jake as if she was seeing him from a new perspective. "That, Ambassador Harrison, is an excellent question. One that I suspect will require considerably more thought than either of us anticipated when this conversation began." As Jake prepared to leave the throne room, escorted by guards who seemed uncertain whether to treat him as an honored guest or a potential security threat, he realized that his desperate gambit had succeeded in ways he'd never intended. He had indeed surprised an immortal queen, but more importantly, he had glimpsed the person behind the crown, someone whose infinite lifespan couldn't protect her from the fundamental loneliness that came with outliving everyone she'd ever cared about. Whether that glimpse would lead to diplomatic success or personal disaster remained to be seen. But for the first time since arriving on Ethereal Prime, Jake felt like he was negotiating with someone who saw him as more than a representative of a species too young to matter in the grand scheme of galactic history. Over the following days, Jake's negotiations with Queen Seraphina took on a character unlike any diplomatic mission in recorded history. Their formal meetings continued in the throne room, surrounded by advisors and protocol officials, but increasingly their real conversations happened during private walks through the palace's impossible gardens, where crystalline trees sang with the wind and flowers bloomed with captured starlight. "Your species fascinates me," Seraphina said as they strolled through a grove where the very air shimmered with bioluminescent pollen. "Humans accomplish more in a single century than most species achieve in a millennium, precisely because you know your time is limited." Jake paused beside a fountain that defied physics, its water flowing upward in spirals that formed temporary sculptures before dissolving back into the recycling system. "We're driven by urgency, I suppose. When you only have 70 or 80 years, every decade matters. Every choice carries weight because you can't afford to waste time on paths that lead nowhere. Whereas I have the luxury of patience," Seraphina mused, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely certain it was a luxury. "I can watch civilizations evolve, can take centuries to make decisions, can afford to wait for perfect solutions rather than accepting merely adequate ones. But doesn't that paralysis sometimes prevent you from acting when action is needed?" The question seemed to surprise her, as if she'd never considered that immortality might come with its own limitations. Paralysis is, perhaps too strong a word. But you raise an interesting point. When you have infinite time to consider options, the urgency that drives innovation can be lost. They had been walking for an hour, their conversation ranging across philosophy, technology, and the fundamental differences between species that measured progress in decades versus those that thought in millennia. Jake found himself increasingly comfortable in Seraphina's presence, her immortal perspective providing insights into galactic history that no human had ever accessed. "Tell me about your marriage proposal," she said suddenly, stopping beside a crystal bench that seemed to grow from the garden path itself. "Not the diplomatic rationale you offered in the throne room, but the real reason behind it." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "You want the honest answer?" "I've found that honest answers are usually more interesting than diplomatic ones." Jake settled onto the bench beside her, noting how the crystal adjusted its temperature to provide comfortable seating. "The honest answer is that I was frustrated beyond rational thought. 3 days of negotiations that felt more like polite dismissals, 3 days of being treated like a representative of a species too young to take seriously. When you asked what proof humanity could offer of our commitment, I realized that conventional diplomacy was never going to bridge the gap between our perspectives. So you suggested binding your personal future to mine. I suggested the one thing that would prove a human was willing to stake everything on a relationship with your people. Marriage isn't just a political alliance for humans, it's a promise to build something together that neither partner could create alone." Seraphina was quiet for a moment, her luminescent features thoughtful. "And were you speaking purely in terms of species diplomacy? Or was there something more personal in your proposal?" The question hung between them like a challenge and an invitation. Jake realized that they had moved far beyond the safe territory of diplomatic discourse into something that could reshape both their lives in ways neither government had authorized. At first, it was purely diplomatic, he admitted. A desperate attempt to find some angle that might work when everything else had failed. But the more time I spend with you, the more I wonder whether the personal and political aspects might not be as separate as I initially thought. Before Seraphina could respond, the peaceful atmosphere of their conversation was shattered by the arrival of Lord Commander Voss, accompanied by a full squad of palace guards. His expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who had finally found the evidence he'd been seeking. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I must interrupt this discussion. Our intelligence networks have uncovered disturbing information about Ambassador Harrison's true mission." Jake felt the careful trust he and Seraphina had been building threatened by whatever accusations Voss was prepared to make. "Lord Commander, I've been completely transparent about my government's objectives. Have you?" Voss cut him off, activating a holographic display that filled the garden air with technical schematics. These are detailed analyses of the crystal formations you've requested mining rights for. Not the simple energy storage applications you described, but something far more significant. The schematics showed molecular structures that Jake recognized from classified briefings, crystalline matrices that could indeed revolutionize human technology, but not in the ways he'd been authorized to discuss publicly. Those crystals, when properly refined, could accelerate human technological development by centuries, Voss continued. Quantum computing, faster-than-light communication, even limited temporal manipulation. In the wrong hands, they could destabilize the entire galactic power structure. Serafina studied the displays with the kind of analytical intensity that came from 1,000 years of evaluating threats to her empire. "Ambassador," she said quietly, "is this information accurate?" Jake realized he was facing a moment that would define not just his diplomatic mission, but whatever relationship was developing between him and the immortal queen. He could deny the implications, claim ignorance of the crystal's advanced applications, and probably salvage some version of the original trade agreement. Or he could trust that the honesty she'd valued in their private conversations was worth the risk of complete failure. "The information is accurate," he said finally. "Those crystals could indeed accelerate human development far beyond what I was authorized to discuss publicly. But the applications Lord Commander Voss is concerned about aren't part of humanity's immediate research agenda. We're decades away from understanding temporal manipulation or quantum consciousness transfer." "Decades," Voss spat. "For a species that develops as rapidly as yours, decades are nothing. You're asking us to provide you with the tools that could make humanity a rival to Etherian power within your own lifetimes." The accusation crystallized the fundamental tension that had undermined their negotiations from the beginning, the fear that helping younger species advance would inevitably threaten the dominance of established civilizations. It was the same thinking that had kept the galaxy stratified between ancient empires and struggling newcomers for millennia. "Yes," Jake said simply. "I suppose I am asking for that." The admission sent shockwaves through the assembled guards and advisors, but Jake continued speaking, addressing himself directly to Serafina. "I'm asking you to trust that humanity's advancement doesn't have to come at the cost of Etherian decline. I'm asking you to consider that cooperation between equals might create more prosperity than dominance by a single species, no matter how benevolent that dominance might be." Serafina rose from the crystal bench, her movements fluid and precise, her expression unreadable. "You're asking me to gamble the stability of an empire I've spent 1,000 years building on the possibility that humans will use advanced technology responsibly. I'm asking you to bet on the same thing you've been betting on since you agreed to meet with me," Jake replied. "That some connections are worth the risk they entail." The garden fell silent except for the musical chiming of crystal leaves stirring in the artificial breeze. Jake could see Voss and the guards waiting for Serafina's command, could feel the weight of a decision that would affect not just their species but the entire balance of galactic civilization. "Lord Commander," Serafina said finally, her voice carrying the authority of absolute rule, "you and your guards will escort Ambassador Harrison to his quarters and ensure his safety while I consider the implications of what we've learned today." Voss's expression showed he wanted to argue for more severe measures, but he had served Serafina long enough to recognize when a decision was final. "Of course, Your Majesty. Though I hope you'll consider the long-term consequences of trusting a species whose growth rate makes them inherently unpredictable." As Jake was led away from the gardens toward the diplomatic quarters, he caught Serafina's eye one final time. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her gaze suggested that their conversation was far from over. That evening, as Jake sat in his chambers contemplating the probable end of his diplomatic career, a soft chime announced an unexpected visitor. Serafina appeared at his door, dressed not in royal robes but in simple clothes that made her look more like a person than an immortal ruler. "May I come in?" she asked, and Jake realized that for the first time since he'd met her, Queen Serafina was asking permission rather than commanding obedience. "Always," he replied, stepping aside to admit someone whose presence had become more important to him than any diplomatic success. As she entered his quarters, Jake understood that they had reached a moment that would determine whether his impulsive marriage proposal had been the beginning of something extraordinary or simply the most spectacular diplomatic failure in human history. Serafina moved through Jake's quarters with the same fluid grace she displayed everywhere else, but in the intimate space of his chambers, her immortal composure seemed more fragile, more human. She paused at the window that looked out over her capital city, the bioluminescent patterns beneath her translucent skin reflecting the starlight like captured constellations. "Do you know what terrifies an immortal, Jake?" she asked without turning to face him. "I honestly can't imagine," he replied, settling into a chair that gave him a clear view of her profile against the cosmic vista beyond. "Stagnation," she said simply. "The realization that infinite time can become an infinite prison if you allow fear to prevent growth. I have ruled for 1,000 years by making careful decisions, by prioritizing stability over change, by choosing the safety of known outcomes over the uncertainty of new possibilities." She turned from the window, her luminescent eyes holding depths that spoke of centuries of accumulated wisdom and equally accumulated regret. "Your proposal forced me to confront something I've been avoiding for longer than your entire species has existed. Which is that safety and growth are often mutually exclusive. That the very caution that has made my rule stable has also made it limited." Jake leaned forward, sensing that they were approaching the heart of everything that had passed between them since his impulsive question in the throne room. "Limited how?" Serafina moved to the chair across from him, her movements carrying a vulnerability he'd never seen before. "I have built an empire that can maintain itself without change, without risk, without the kind of leaps of faith that define progress. It's a magnificent achievement, but it's also a beautiful cage, for my people and for myself. And my marriage proposal represented everything my careful approach to rulership has taught me to avoid. Unpredictability. Emotional decision-making. Personal desires that might conflict with imperial necessity." She paused, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors Jake was learning to read as complex emotions. "It also represented the one thing I've denied myself in 1,000 years of rule." "What's that?" "Choice," she said quietly. "Real choice, based on what I want rather than what duty demands. When you asked if marrying you would prove humanity's commitment, you were really asking if I was brave enough to choose partnership over control, growth over safety, possibility over certainty." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that their conversation had moved beyond diplomacy into territory that would reshape both their lives regardless of political consequences. "And what's your answer?" Before Serafina could respond, urgent chimes filled the chamber, followed by the voice of the palace AI announcing an emergency council session. Through the windows, Jake could see military transports moving through the city's transport streams with the purposeful efficiency that spoke of crisis response. "Your Majesty," came Vasa's voice through the communication system, "the council demands immediate convening. There are reports of human fleet movements throughout the sector, and several council members are calling for Ambassador Harrison's immediate detention." Serafina rose with fluid grace, but Jake could see the tension in her luminescent features. "It seems, Jake, that our conversation will have to wait. The Council has apparently decided that your presence represents a clear and present danger to imperial security. Are you going to let them detain me?" "That," she said with a smile that held both sadness and determination, "depends on whether you trust me enough to attend this council session voluntarily. Because I suspect that what's about to unfold will require both of us to make choices that our respective governments never authorized." The council chamber was a symphony of crystalline architecture and barely controlled hostility. Representatives from dozens of Etherian worlds filled the tiered seating, their luminescent forms creating patterns of light that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. At the chamber's center, Lord Commander Voss presided over a holographic display showing human fleet positions throughout the sector. "The evidence is undeniable," Voss declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "Human military forces have been steadily repositioning throughout our territory under the cover of routine patrol operations. Ambassador Harrison's mission was clearly designed to gather intelligence while human forces prepared for a coordinated advance. Jake stood beside Seraphina's throne, technically under guard but not yet formally detained. He could feel the weight of hundreds of immortal gazes, beings who had lived through countless wars and political upheavals, now judging whether humanity represented opportunity or threat. "Lord Commander," Seraphina said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute rule, "what specific aggressive actions have human forces taken? Have they violated our territorial boundaries? Threatened our installations? Made any demands backed by military force?" "Not yet, Your Majesty, but the pattern of movement suggests." "Suggests preparation," Seraphina cut him off. "Which could indicate hostile intentions or simply prudent readiness for any eventuality. The same readiness our own forces maintain when dealing with unknown factors." Council member Theron, an ancient Etherian whose luminescence had faded to barely visible patterns, spoke from the upper tiers. "Your Majesty, we have protected this empire for 3 millennia by recognizing threats before they could fully manifest. The human pattern of rapid expansion, combined with their request for crystals that could accelerate their development by centuries, represents exactly the kind of existential threat our ancestors warned us to guard against." The murmur of agreement that rippled through the council chamber made Jake realize how precarious his position had become. These weren't just political leaders, they were beings who had personally witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, who had learned to identify the warning signs of species that might challenge Etherian dominance. "Council member Theron raises valid concerns," Seraphina acknowledged. "However, I would remind this assembly that isolation and suspicion have never been the foundation of Etherian strength. We became the dominant force in this sector through alliance building, through recognizing opportunity where others saw only threat." "Alliance building with species that knew their place," Voss interjected. "Humans show no inclination toward subordinate partnership. They seek equality, which means they seek to replace us." The accusation crystallized everything Jake had struggled against since arriving on Ethereal Prime. He could remain silent, allow the council to debate his fate as if he were merely an object to be disposed of, or he could speak truth to power and accept whatever consequences followed. "You're right," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "Humanity does seek equality. We seek partnership based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance. We believe that cooperation between equals creates more prosperity than submission to superiors." The admission sent shockwaves through the assembly, but Jake continued, addressing himself to Seraphina while speaking for the entire council to hear. "But equality doesn't require replacement. Growth doesn't require conquest. What I've learned during my time here is that your empire has achieved something remarkable, a stability that spans millennia, a peace that protects countless billions of beings, a structure that has prevented the kind of galactic warfare that destroys civilizations." He paused, meeting Seraphina's luminescent gaze across the chamber. "What humanity offers isn't competition for that achievement, but partnership in expanding it. Our rapid development, combined with your accumulated wisdom, could create something neither species could achieve alone." "Pretty words," Voss replied coldly, "but words are easily spoken and more easily broken. What guarantee can you offer that human partnership won't become human dominance once your species has access to our advanced technologies?" Jake realized he was facing the same question that had started this entire diplomatic mission, but now with far higher stakes. The answer came to him with the clarity of absolute conviction. "I can offer the same guarantee I offered Queen Seraphina in our first meeting," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. "My life, bound to hers, making humanity's word literally our bond." The chamber erupted in shocked exclamations, but Jake continued speaking, his attention focused entirely on Seraphina. "I formally request marriage with Queen Seraphina, not as a diplomatic strategy but as a personal choice. Two beings choosing to build something together that neither could create alone, regardless of what their governments might prefer." The silence that followed was absolute. Jake could see Seraphina weighing not just his proposal but the implications of accepting it, the challenge to her authority, the precedent it would set, the changes it would force on an empire built on stability and predictable outcomes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that would reshape the balance of galactic power. "I accept," she said simply, rising from her throne with movements that seemed to bend light around her. "But with conditions that this council must understand." She moved to the chamber's center, her luminescent form commanding attention from every being present. "I will marry Jake Harrison, but I will also step down from active rule of the Etherian Empire. After 1,000 years, it's time for our civilization to be governed by elected councils rather than immortal monarchs." The chamber exploded in shocked protests, but Seraphina's voice cut through the chaos with absolute authority. "I will retain the title of Queen Emeritus and serve as advisor to the new government, but the Empire will no longer depend on a single immortal perspective. It will grow and change and take risks, because that's how civilizations remain vital across the kind of timescales we inhabit." She turned to look directly at Jake, her expression mixing love with determination and infinite possibility. "And yes, Council Member Voss, this marriage will serve as humanity's bond. But it will also serve as proof that some connections transcend the political calculations that have governed galactic relations for too long." The debate that followed lasted 18 hours and reshaped the political structure of one of the galaxy's oldest empires. In the end, the council accepted Seraphina's proposal. Partly because they respected her wisdom, partly because they recognized the futility of arguing with someone who had ruled successfully for a millennium, and partly because the marriage contract she negotiated included safeguards that protected Etherian interests while allowing for unprecedented cooperation with humanity. 3 months later, Jake stood in a ceremony chamber that defied human architectural understanding, waiting for his bride to appear with nervousness that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol and everything to do with the magnitude of what they were about to promise each other. When Seraphina appeared, dressed in robes that seemed woven from captured starlight, Jake realized that his impulsive question had led him to something he'd never expected to find, not just diplomatic success, but partnership with someone whose immortal perspective had been transformed by the urgency of mortal love. "Any regrets?" she asked as they prepared to exchange vows that would bind their lives across whatever time they were given. "Only one," Jake replied, taking her luminescent hands in his. "I regret that it took a desperate diplomatic gambit to realize that some questions are worth asking even when you don't know the answer." "And I regret," Seraphina said with a smile that could have illuminated star systems, "that it took 1,000 years to learn that the most important choices are the ones that terrify you into growth." As they spoke the vows that would unite their species in ways no treaty could accomplish, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had come to Ethereal Prime seeking mining rights and had found something infinitely more valuable. Proof that love could indeed bridge any gap when both partners were brave enough to choose growth over safety, possibility over certainty, and each other over everything their respective worlds had taught them to value above personal happiness. The Queen had dismissed her guards with a single gesture, but in the end, it was she who had dismissed an entire empire's expectations to choose the adventure of building something new with someone who saw her as more than an immortal symbol of power. Some proposals, Jake thought as he kissed his immortal bride while representatives of dozens of species cheered around them, were worth making even when, especially when, they changed everything you thought you knew about what was possible.